So thank you all for coming. I can't tell you how happy I am to be speaking here. This is my favorite conference, so to be able to just be standing here is awesome. My name is Arthur. I manage one of the AppSec teams at Ping Identity. And I'm here today to tell you all about FairStride, which is a framework. Louder? Closer to the mic. All right. So I'm here today to tell you all about FairStride, which is a framework we developed to have engineering threats and the business be able to speak apples to apples when threat modeling. So just an agenda slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of how I got to this material, and then I'll talk about the components that came into building this thing. First, I'll talk about Stride and how we threat model with it. Then I'll talk about quantitative methods and FAIR and Monte Carlo simulations and why they matter and how they differ from how we do things typically in engineering. And then I'll give a little demo so you guys have some sort of tactical stuff to go home with, and then we'll close it up. So back in 2019, I was at RMISC, which is a conference out in Colorado, which is where I live. The keynote was Mikko Hipponen, who's the head of research for F-Secure. He had during his keynote on the state of the net slide that was massive that had tires perpetually burning, and he said, in security, when we do our jobs right, nothing happens. That was very disheartening. I'd just gotten promoted to management, and my job is to make my team successful and to align the success of the individuals on the team with the interests of the business. And so to hear that the best that I could do is nothing was a problem that I couldn't ignore. We tried a lot of things during that year as far as measuring our success, but nothing really seemed to hit the mark for me. Until about a year later when I came to this very conference before the world shut down. And Clint gave his keynote on how to 10x your security without the Series D. The general thesis of the talk is if you're able to remove bug classes from your code base, then you gain time and you move the needle measurably as far as the risk posture of your applications. He centered this around two main use cases. The first one was secure by default frameworks, and the second one was SEMGREP rules to make sure that your code doesn't reintroduce vulnerabilities. Now, this was really encouraging because for the first time I was like, oh shit, we can actually have a path upwards from where we are now. But then I came to another realization, which is I don't know what the hell risk is. I don't know how to measure it. I don't know how to perceive it. I don't really know anything about it apart from some people talk about it, and apparently bad things happen when risk is involved occasionally. So I picked up this book called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, which is absolutely phenomenal. It's very complete. It has a lot of resources that have to do with quantitative methods to be able to evaluate and use risk in your enterprise. A lot of what they talk about and how they position things in that book is very much from a CISO view. And what we're going to do today is we're going to bring that down to the AppSec level. So it's really just a rescoping of all the techniques that are in that book. I got the audiobook. It was like $9. So if you got $9, you should get that. The last thing that I had to put up here is the FairU risk lens tool. I'm not sponsored by them or anything like that, but it is really awesome and very easy to use. And you can get kind of a very elegant view of how FAIR works and how quantitative methods work with like a very small amount of effort relative to reading that whole book. So if you want to give it a shot, give it a shot. It's awesome. All right, so what are we doing today as far as modeling threats? There are many approaches to threat modeling, but today I'm going to talk about Stride. So Stride was invented at Microsoft in the early 2000s as a part of their secure computing initiatives. There are, as I mentioned, other methods more artistic than others to be able to model threats, but Stride is really good because it's a repeatable framework. And if you're going to train a team of more than, say, 2 or 3 people, it's really good to have a way to go about training them. And if you have developers that are interested in security and in threat modeling, and you can give them a framework, again, it's better for being able to share that knowledge. It's not rocket science, but it is awesome. What you do is you build a data flow diagram of your application. You draw trust boundaries and processes and data stores and arrows that show how the data goes from A to B to C. And then you enumerate threats that fit in the STRIDE buckets. So the STRIDE buckets follow that acronym. It's spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. This is great, right? We actually have a systematic way to go about seeing what might go wrong with our application, even if it's not implemented yet. The output from this is a list of things that could go wrong, or a risk registry. And then we have to prioritize how we fix things. Do you guys hear those bumps in the thing? So we have to prioritize how we fix things after we've already enumerated them. And as far as I can tell in the industry, we follow some modification or some version of CVSS score calculators. So you find a threat, you go to the NIST website, you say the attack vector is the network and the impact to confidentiality is low, and then you click a bunch of buttons, and that creates a score from 0 to 10 of on the CVSS scale. That 0 to 10 then gets mapped to high, medium, or low, depending on what bracket you fall into. So this is pretty good, right? But it's not very sophisticated. And I mean that from a mathematical perspective. So high, medium, low, critical, informational, those are what's called ordinal scales, which means that they're very good at putting things... Jesus Christ, what is this? I put it down? Okay. Okay, sounds good. So high, medium, low, critical, informational, those are all those are an ordinal scale, which means that they're very good at putting things in order. So a high is higher than a medium, and a medium is higher than a low, but they're not very good at combining elements in each one of these buckets. So you can't compare 5 mediums to a high, and you can't compare 1,000 lows to a high either. Neither can you compare the mediums with one another. So your security expertise might say, hey, this one is more important than that one, but that's not a product of the scale that you're using. To drive that point home, Bishop Fox put out this ebook called The Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, which is really fantastic. This is basically a recollection of a whole bunch of nasty things that their consultants did with a bunch of lows. So from an offensive perspective and a technical perspective, you can combine a bunch of lows in the kill chain. But when we look at it from a risk perspective and a risk registry on the defensive side, we don't combine them. So just from that perspective, we're starting already on the back foot. So how can we do better? Today, I'm going to propose that we do things better by looking at the impact of vulnerabilities on the business rather than on the applications themselves. So if we think about how an AppSec program is built, you have a whole bunch of things that generate findings. You got tools, you got pen testers, you have bug bounty programs, you got your internal developers that find things that are weird, you got your security team that's going and trying to break stuff. And all those things kind of funnel into your security team. Your AppSec team can then go and say, all right, these 4, don't worry about them. We know about a compensate and control, move them aside. And then these 2, we should actually send them over to the remediation team. And so then that gets passed over to the remediation team. They go and spend some time, which costs money, to be able to go fix the thing, depending on your setup and your SDLC. You might have some QA cycles that you have to go through. You might have some release documentation cycles that you have to go through there, and all these things cost people hours, which cost money. You might also have to notify your customers, right? If something is really bad and you have to tell them, you have to set up a campaign and you have to go and work with people throughout your business and take their time away from their job to be able to go and fix the thing that you found. And then you also have people escalating up to your support team and your customer success team saying, hey, this thing is broken. Can you please help me be reassured about my posture? So all this to say, we're going to look at it from a process perspective rather than a RC against your application perspective. Just a quick note about FAIR. FAIR is super elegant. It's a way to break down risk in a way that's specific to InfoSec. I mentioned before that this is very much at the CISO view, and we're going to scope this down to the application view. If you Google for FAIR, you're going to find this this tree. I added a dotted line in the middle there because I just wanted to make a point that if you need to break things down further in the tree, you can go ahead and do that, but it's not necessary. So you don't have to make your way all the way down to contact frequency. You could just stop at loss event frequency if it makes sense for the way that you're estimating things. And I'm going to walk through each one of these here in a sec. So let's talk about loss magnitude. Loss magnitude is the amount of money that is going to cost when something goes wrong or when a loss event occurs. This is always expressed as a 90% confidence interval. Now, what that means is that the accuracy of your estimation is going to come from the percentage of your confidence, meaning that if you create a 90% confidence interval, you want to be 90% sure that the value that will occur over the next 12 months will be in that interval, versus trying to be as precise as possible with your interval and making it as tight as possible so that you can get the sort of the best idea of what your value is actually going to be. So as an example, if I'm going to estimate the price of a gallon of gas in San Francisco in 12 months, I could say, oh, it's going to be $5.50, but I'm going to be wrong a lot of the times. Sometimes it's going to be $6, sometimes it might be $4.50, it might be $5. But if I say, hey, it's going to be in the neighborhood, or I'm 90% sure that it's going to be anywhere from $3.50 to $7, pending any kind of geopolitical issues or pandemics or anything like that, I actually have a good range where I'm confident that I'm 90% confident that it'll fall in that value. And we allow for 5% outliers on the top and on the bottom side of that estimation. Loss magnitude is broken down into primary and secondary losses. Primary losses are losses that happen every time that a loss event occurs, and they're usually inflicted by the business upon itself. Secondary losses are losses that are usually inflicted on the business by a third party, and that they do not occur every time a loss event occurs. A lot of what we're going to see today as far as primary losses go are going to be security engineering cycles, because all the findings will make their way into the security team to be triaged, but not all of them will have to pay a bounty for, or not all of them will have to trigger engineering cycles to go fix things. On the other side, we have loss event frequency. So loss event frequency is the probability that something bad that will cause a loss will occur within the next 12 months. And we're going to use 12 months here because scoping the time of your probability is very, very important in the way that you get the strategic insights out of this modeling, as well as the actual probability that you're going to get. So the probability that your company is going to get owned tomorrow is very, very close to zero. But the probability that your company is going to get owned in the next 15 years is very close to 100. So scoping this appropriately is going to give you a different number. As I mentioned, we're going to be using 12 months here, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is as we go through. Loss event frequency is broken down into threat event frequency and vulnerability. So threat event frequency is the frequency with which you perceive a threat from an external actor. So this could be seeing a cross-site scripting payload. And vulnerability is the conversion of that into a loss event. Vulnerability is broken down, and actually vulnerability is defined differently in FAIR than it is inside of the usual security engineering community. Here, vulnerability is not a security bug. It is the relationship between the strength of your controls and the strength of your adversaries and the strength of their attacks. So vulnerability will tell us if the threat event has been converted into a loss event. Vulnerability is actually a quite complicated area of FAIR that can warrant a talk by itself. But suffice it to say that you can think of this as the strength of a dam versus a hurricane, or the strength of your DDoS protection against a bunch of traffic. Threat event frequency is broken down into contact frequency and probability of action. Contact frequency is the frequency with which a threat actor makes contact with your assets. So this can be some recon, building out a site map, et cetera, et cetera. And then when that cross-site scripting payload gets delivered, that gets converted into a threat event. And so the probability of action is the probability of that occurring. So what do we do with all this stuff? We've estimated a bunch of things. What do we actually do with it? We're going to feed all this stuff into a Monte Carlo simulation. So Monte Carlo simulations were invented by John von Neumann and Stanislaw Ulam at the Manhattan Project. They needed a way to educate their decision-making so that, based on their understanding and with a complete lack of historical data, they wouldn't make any kind of egregious mistakes when, building the dangerous things that they built in the Manhattan Project. They called it, everything had to have a code name. And they called it Monte Carlo simulations after the casino. Apparently, one of the researchers had an uncle that had some gambling problems, and they figured they could use it afterwards to figure out how much money he might have to borrow from the family. The general idea of the Monte Carlo simulation is that we're going to take our uncertainty about our position through the estimations that I talked about before, and we're going to generate, for all intents and purposes, historical data. So computing has existed for, Linux time started in 1970. The security industry is maybe 30 years old. With these methods, we can generate 1,000 years of data, 10,000 years of data, and then use that data to analyze, we can then analyze that data as if it was historical. And then as we make changes, the data is going to change and our analysis is going to change. So these simulations are always taking the form of picking points on probability distributions. For today, we're only going to be talking about log normal distributions to model the dollars lost for each one of the loss types that we're going to enumerate. Log normal distributions are suitable for this because they have no negative values, which means you're not going to lose negative dollars, which is good. And they also have very long tails, which means that they'll pick up outlier events on the top side. And pay no attention to the numbers on the scale. They mean absolutely nothing. Just as an example, these are the black curve could be, for example, the model of your bug bounty payouts. The blue curve might be your engineering cycles, and the red curve might be for PR campaigns. They all look a little bit different, but they share those same properties. And the reason they look different is because the inputs to these curves are the estimations that we had as far as loss magnitude. And when I do the demo, I'll show you exactly what this means. So what's the TLDR for if you want to do fair stride? The TLDR is that you're going to model threats with stride. You're going to feed the output from your threat model into a Monte Carlo simulation rather than a set of CVSS score calculators. And then you're going to use loss exceedance curves, which are the output from the model, to define a baseline, a goalpost, and to measure your progress from where you're at to where you want to be. And I'll show you exactly what a loss exceedance curve is in the demo. So we're going to do a quick demo here. I'm going to show you a big spreadsheet. It's going to look really gross, but I'll walk you through it. It's not rocket science. None of the data that I'm going to show you or the threats or anything like that are pertinent to ping identity. Everything is completely fake, just to prove a point here. And this is, credit where credit is due. This is basically the one-for-one substitution model that Hubbard and Searson make available for free on howtomeasureanything.com/cybersecurity. So if you want to use the actual simulation here, you can go and download it there for free, or you can hit me up after this talk and I can give you this version of it. All right, bear with me here when I do the display thing. That's not right. It's gross, isn't it? Can you all read this, or do you need me to zoom in more? It's good? All right. So you'll see here on the left these merge cells. These are the different threats that we've enumerated during threat modeling. So you'll see here we have S1 for spoofing 1. We got some tampering down here. We got some repudiation, some information disclosure. We got some denial of service, and we got some elevation of privilege. Now, instead of having the output of this be a high, medium, or a low, we actually have a list of things that can go wrong, also known as loss types. So these are all things that can cost money and that don't always cost money. I mentioned earlier primary and secondary losses. They have, secondary losses have a probability of occurring that is not 100%. Primary losses will occur every time. So you'll see here the primary losses that we have are essentially just security engineering cycles. Now you'll note here that it doesn't say 100%. That says 20%. That is the probability of the event occurring over the next 12 months. Now, the 20% here is just making a point. So if, for example, you're implementing best practices and you have, let's say you have TLS implemented everywhere, which is pretty standard these days, and somebody is starting to move data, confidential data in transit through that. If you were to go to your engineering team and say, what are we going to do to make that better? They're going to say, we're already doing the best thing. Please go away and do something else. But that doesn't mean that best practice today won't be best practice tomorrow. So, pre-log4j, threat models would have looked very different as post-log4j. And so what you can do is you can go look at historical data, and CVE databases are quite robust and have a lot of information in them. You can go back into your historical data of CVEs and say, all right, in the last, say, 10 years, how many years have there been one or more CVEs that have broken the confidentiality of TLS in one way or another? And you can count them. You can say, all right, well, there were 2 years out of the last 10 where confidentiality was broken in TLS. Therefore, it's reasonable that we would have a 20% chance of this best practice being broken over the next 12 months. Obviously, that's not a spoofing issue, but I'm just making a point. You'll see below here, for example, that we have the probability that we're going to have to pay out a bounty is going to be the probability that the event actually occurs times the probability that it came from the bug bounty program. So you can go through all the vulnerabilities that you've had over the last say year or two, and count the ones that came from the bug bounty program and say, all right, it's reasonable that a subset of those are going to be maybe X amount of percent are going to be coming from the bug bounty program, and you just multiply one by the other. And that gives you a smaller percentage of having to actually pay out the bounty. Here are the 90% confidence intervals for each one of these loss types. You can measure these differently. So if you're going to measure, say, support cycles, those might be measured by that business unit by the number of, or the average cost of a support case, and counting the support cases that are pertinent to security. You might also go look at your engineering cycles and say, how much is it going to cost me to actually fix a bug? Like, how can I come up with an estimate for that? So you can go and look at, how the quickest and the longest time it's taken to fix a security bug inside your organization. Multiply that by the average hourly rate of your engineers, if you have access to that information. If not, you can just go to Glassdoor, and that'll give you an estimate for a lower bound and an upper bound. And you'll note that all the ways that you measure these things are different for every loss type, but they boil down to dollars ultimately, which means that you can normalize them to dollars. All right, so now for the meat and potatoes. So these 3 columns here, so simulated inherent loss, impact RAND, and probability RAND, are essentially the simulation in action. Probability RAND is the probability that the event actually occurred. You'll note that probability RAND is the same for each one of these loss types. That's because we don't want, I talked about how you have security having the being engaged every time, and then the other loss types not being engaged every time. We don't want a higher probability for some of the loss types that shouldn't be happening if security was not engaged. So since this is for one specific threat, we actually have the same random number selected for all of them. Impact rand is going to be picking the random point on the probability distribution of the simulation. And this really weird looking formula is the actual simulation. So you'll see here that if the probability rand is smaller than the probability of the event occurring, then you get a loss event. If not, nothing happens. And you'll see here nothing happens for this specific type. If you do end up having this probability rand being smaller than your estimation, you're going to go into this lognormal.inv function, and if not, you're going to go to 0. The lognormal.inv is the actual function that's going to pick the point on the distribution. You'll note that it takes in the random number right here, and it takes in the mean as it takes in the your bounds for your confidence interval as the mean, and then it takes in your bounds from your confidence interval as the standard deviation. You'll note that 3.29 figure there, that's based on the 90% of the confidence interval. That number will be different if you're 80% or 95%, but I'm not going to get into that. But essentially what you end up with is sometimes nothing happens for a particular threat or for certain losses, and sometimes things do happen. So you'll see that in this case, we lost $22,000 due to security engineering cycles because of this spoofing threat. I mentioned earlier that we're going to be simulating 1,000 years of data. So right now what we're looking at is year number 62. So on year 62, if we add all the values together of the simulated inherent loss, we end up with $225,807. So that's how much we lost because of security issues based on our understanding against this specific application on year 62 of the simulation. And if we go down here at the table that shows you all the years of the simulation, you'll see that year 62, we lost $225,807. You'll note that on year 63, we lost almost 800 grand. On year 1, we lost over $1 million bucks. But on year 7, we only lost 167,000. So our uncertainty has now been extrapolated into these outputs in dollars. And now we can ask some really interesting questions. And the most important one is, what is the probability that we're going to lose X dollars or more over the next 12 months due to security issues? And we can just count, right? We can go to 280,000 and say, all right, I'm going to count how many of these values are greater than 280,000. And 40.7% of them will be. You'll note that we've had no losses less than 140 grand for this application. And the most that we've lost is a little bit over 2.1 million. Okay, so we're going to plot those against each other, and we're going to end up with what's called a loss exceedance curve. The loss exceedance curve is a more mathematically sophisticated way to express the risk of our application versus a registry of a whole bunch of items that are high, medium, or low. You'll note here that inherent risk is red and residual risk is green. Residual risk is the measure of our progress. Inherent risk is our baseline. For some reason, Excel put the green curve on top of the red curve, but they're the same at this point. Now, the interesting thing is we can go to an executive and we can say, hey, executive, what probability are you willing to accept that you will lose 500 grand or more against this application over the next 12 months? And they might say, whoa, I don't want to lose any money against this application. And we could say, okay, that's good. But based on our simulation, we found that right now we're accepting a 7.7% chance that that's going to occur. So what's something reasonable that makes sense for you? And you can negotiate that. And in this case, we negotiated 2%. You'll note that the values here are always going to be 100 for 100K and 20% for 200K and much, much smaller for $1 million. So now we have a baseline and we have a goalpost. And now we can measure our progress from one to the other. So if, for example, I want to say implement a semgrep rule to remove a particular bug class from my code base, I can do that and I can measure it against a process improvement. So I'm going to be measuring a technical control against a process, which is not something you can do with CVSS scores. So for example, this elevation of privilege has two attack vectors. It's either through JSON, so remote code execution through JSON processing, or through XML. Let's say you write a semgrep rule to make DTDs disabled by default, and you would therefore reduce the likelihood of this specific threat happening by 50% because you remove 50% of the attack vectors. And so you can add that value into this sheet. And then I can rerun my simulation. And lo and behold, the green curve has moved away from the red curve. So the needle that we've moved is the area under each one of these curves. So some businesses might only care about losses greater than $1 million. Some businesses will look at this more holistically. But what we've done here is we've seen, okay, well, we started at area equals X, and now we're at area equals X minus K. So we've moved that needle. Now the interesting part is, how does this compare to a process improvement? So let's say we notice that we spend a lot of time responding to customer escalations. And maybe we have good relationships with our support org, and we're able to build an FAQ that says, hey, this is how you're going to respond to these things. And we might reduce the impact of that or the likelihood of that occurring by, say, 10%. And maybe we hope to be able to do that. So I'll go to my customer success cycles here and my support loss type. And let's say I can reduce those by 10%. And now I can apply this to all possible threat types because the support cycles are going to apply across the board. It doesn't matter if support's responding to, elevation of privilege or denial of service. Whoops. Just bear with me for a second. Cool. And now I can rerun my simulation. And lo and behold, the residual risk curve has moved differently away from the inherent risk curve. So I've now, if I compare the area under the curve of this versus a semgrep rule, I can actually compare their impact apples to apples. Now, it might be very cheap to implement a semgrep rule. You just go write some YAML and you're done. But maybe you work at a really legacy organization that doesn't have a CI/CD pipeline or doesn't have all the infrastructure needed to have semgrep in place. Maybe you work at a modern organization that doesn't yet have semgrep implemented, and that might cost some money and some time to set up. So you can do a cost-benefit analysis for that versus setting up an FAQ or building a self-serve tool for support. And from a leadership perspective, this is really exciting because I can build initiatives for my team that are meaningful to the business and that so they can understand the impact that they have, and I can actually go report that back to somebody that cares about dollars. And that's super exciting to me. That's not right. There we go. Cool. So again, what's the TLDR for fair stride? You model threats with stride. You feed the output of your threat model into a Monte Carlo simulation rather than a bunch of CVSS score calculators. And then you use loss exceedance curves to define a baseline, a goalpost, and your progress from point A to point B. So how can this improve your program? Well, as I mentioned, you can meaningfully prioritize your efforts beyond compliance. Compliance is super important because it, even though it's checkboxy and it's not like the coolest thing in the security world, it actually brings dollars in because it enables your business to sell the thing that you're doing compliance for. So that's great on the one side. But then on the other side, once you're done with that and you've automated your way through it, What your purpose is to reduce the, at least as an AppSec team, is to reduce the losses associated with security issues. And so we're actually able to do that here, which means that we can have insight that is strategically significant and actually be able to build something that our engineers care to contribute to. This is heavily related to that third point about reducing burnout. I think this year there's a few talks about burnout, and last year there were also like 2 or 3 talks about burnout at this conference. We have a pretty rough job in security. Everything's broken all the time. Sometimes people get cynical, and a lot of the times that happens because what we're doing isn't necessarily perceived as meaningful by the business. But if the business stakeholders understand what we do in the same way that what the product teams do as far as dollars, then we can put ourselves in a position that's at least setting us up in the language of success. Maybe your insights won't be as successful as others, but at least you're on this trail that everybody understands. And from a leadership perspective, again, that's super, super exciting. My job is to make other people successful, and this is a way to do that. That point in the middle about justifying investment or why not to pay for things, if you can use these methods to understand what the value of a particular problem is to you, or at least get a sense of it. So if a vendor comes to you and says, hey, I'm solving this new and interesting problem, give me a bunch of money, you can actually have some leverage on how much money that thing might cost and why that's important. This will also avoid you hiring too many people or justify whether or not you need to hire more people. If you have too many people on your team, you're lucky, but at some point, the business is going to realize and they're going to say, you gotta get rid of some people. And that's not fun for anybody. Cool. So if you want to use FairStride, this is a way that you might be able to do that. You can do an assessment now, which means that you're going to have to go talk to a bunch of people about money, and then you're going to have to go talk to your engineers about the probability of bad things happening and what bad things might exist against your applications. You're going to get some strategic insights from that and be able to build some initiatives around them. You're going to execute on those initiatives and measure them independently, but then ultimately boil the progress that you have on all of them back to dollars or likelihood of occurrence. So you would measure the adoption of a SEMGREP rule differently than you would measure how long it takes to fix a bug. But ultimately, all those things will boil down to either one or the other. And then you're going to repeat the assessment 12 months from now. Your application will have changed 12 months from now. Your controls will have changed. The threat landscape will have changed substantially. A lot of things will be different. So being able to repeat this process and create the next year's initiatives and goals and so forth is going to be a good way forward. And that's pretty much it. That's my LinkedIn. I know it's like weird to show QR codes at security conferences, but you don't have to look at it. If you have any questions, or if you want to have any of the materials that I shared today, please hit me up. I'm happy to share everything. None of this is my intellectual property. I just smushed a bunch of things together in a way that makes sense to me. So thank you. Just give me a sec. He was first.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's a topic that's close to my heart. I also know Ping very well, friends work there. I was in this space for about 10 years. I worked at HSBC. So when I joined, my job was to work with the developers and help figure out how to prioritize all the issues, right? And as you pointed out, models like CVSS or severity doesn't really have the business context. So you can't really calculate risk based on just severity. You need impact, or as you call it, loss, and likelihood to be able to calculate risk. The challenge that we encountered when I first went down that path, okay, let's strap model, let's come up with a risk so that we can prioritize based on risk, and they can focus the development effort where it matters most, so you can avoid burnout and spitting your cycles where it doesn't matter. We started just eyeballing it, right? And as you said, that doesn't really work. I mean, one's opinion is different than someone else's opinion. So we started looking at models like this where you provide specific percentages and numbers and all that. And it became complicated. Like, no one wants to go through all those. And not only is it complicated, but also the problem is that you may not have data, right? Like you're saying, well, look at the previous loss. Some teams are like, I never measured it. A team is brand new, so you may not always have the metrics. So it was like, on the one side, it was you eyeball it. On the other side, you go through a really scientific model like this. and neither worked very well at scale. So what we came up with something is in the middle, where you're not eyeballing it and you're not providing all the specific data. So we looked at Dread, right? So Dread has been deprecated because there's some problems with it, but we like the simplicity because it was like, you know what, let's take your impact and break it into reputational impact, you know, how many users were impacted, and financial damage was direct or indirect. But instead of putting numbers, just say, hey, a 3 means you'll go out of business. Everyone can tell, like that's easy. A 1 is like no one hears about it, and 2 is in the middle. You lose some customers, you feel the pain, right? That's easy for everyone to think about. You don't need to do all the scientific analysis, and that model seemed to work really well. So, and I run a consulting company now, and we use that model, and I'm continually monitoring how others do it. And I wanted to get your feedback, like how easy is it to calculate all these numbers? How do you address it when you don't have historic data? It seems like a lot of work and a lot of complexity. Whereas why haven't you gone for a simpler model, like where it's just a 3, 2, 1, and you assess that and you calculate the risk that way? Definitely agree that risk is important. Severity is definitely, it's my pet peeve. I hate it when people just slap a severity and say, here you go, here's 100 issues, and there's no risk. And of course, I came from banking, so everything runs based on a risk model. Yeah, I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, definitely. And we should get a beer after, because I want to talk a bit more about that with you. This took some time. I think it took about, like, Ping has I think 1,300 employees nowadays. It took me about 3 months to build the model. Once you have the base, you can iterate on it pretty quickly. But if you have really big companies, I know that there are ways to go about doing it that make sense, that are based on inference and running certain sort of Bayesian inference things that I don't know much about. But I know that there are ways to go about doing that. I think the thing, what's important to understand is that this is a tool that needs to be useful, and if it's not useful and you have to adjust, you should absolutely adjust. If this model takes you 6 months to build and you're trying to build for 12 months in the future, it's kind of ridiculous. So, that's kind of my high level take on it, but we should talk about that a lot more.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what's going on?
Thank you. I also use the FAIR model. In my job, I also studied as a risk officer. So it's very interesting for me. And my question is, my big challenge was to build the threat list. So the one that you have shown in the Excel. And my question was very, let's say, very basic. Where did you get that? And does it come from the Hubbard Excel, which I don't remember, to be honest? Or did you build it yourself? Is that where you used your 3 months?
No, so actually getting the threats out were pretty easy relative to getting all the business unit owners to give me numbers and to explain to them what confidence intervals are. The threats themselves, I mentioned I run an AppSec team, so I have a team dedicated to doing this. So we're pretty on top of it when it comes to building out those threats, but it's an engineering exercise.
So I noticed in your model you had a phrase here called revenue risk due to churn, which as a security architect I can tell you is very near and dear to my heart.
Okay.
Which I am interpreting as this is such a problem that the entire team leaves, and that is something I've observed. I'm wondering, how did you evaluate that, or how did you actually try and build that into your model?
So actually the definition that we had, or that I have here for it, is churn of customers. So customers leaving you because they don't trust your product anymore. I mentioned, when we do compliance and stuff, it's really to, enable a language of trust with customers. And if that trust is broken, they're going to get out of there, So that's the type of churn that we talk about. And you can measure that one based on, product X makes this many dollars per year. This is what the impact of it will be. But for people leaving and for people leaving your team, I had a line item in there about people getting fired, actually, rather than people leaving. I think that if you I take pride in the fact that I'm able to hold on to people for a long time, because I try to build a program that's comprehensive and that's fun for everybody, including the business. But yeah, sometimes people get fired, and you can, you take salary data and you're like, oh, it's going to be about that much.
Hi. So great presentation. I work in the secure GRC realm, so fair. I understand fair, and I never had a chance to implement at my workplace. Is a little bit tough to implement, right? Because it can go really deep, right? And I see your spreadsheet, right? I see that you have a column called loss type, right? Do you have a process or do you have a source to define the list of loss types?
Absolutely. So I look internally at my program and I look at all the things that we spend time on as a team and as a company. So I start with my team and I as the sort of intake point for all the security things for applications. And then I look at all the teams that we impact downstream. And that's pretty easy on my end because I talk to these people regularly. They're people that I have one-on-ones with. When things go wrong, they're the people that I work with. So I kind of know who's impacted by security issues at my company. And so that's how I build those loss types. They're cycles. If we think about assets and the most expensive things that companies have, it's the rent that you pay for your offices and how much you pay your people. And so everything that's here is the dollars are all people's time, really.
I might have missed it, but where's the intersection with corporate security and the risk? And are they using the similar model? And does that get up leveled when you're talking about resources for team members or whatnot across the whole organization?
When you say corporate security, do you mean
non-app side, non-product side? So you have risks in the organization that are not application, being customer facing. Do they do a similar fair model, or are you doing that for them?
I'm just doing this in a box to help my team. I know what you mean. Like the scope expands and the way that you might lose money diversifies quite a bit. The book is actually scoped to that level,
Okay.
but we don't do that.
Gotcha.
I'm just doing it myself, and it's been helpful for me.
Yeah, and I was just more wondering if your peer on the corporate security side, if they're doing the same thing, right, and up leveling the risks to like a chief risk officer or anything like that.
They have not done that yet.
All right, awesome. Thank you.
I wish they did, but they haven't. Yeah, for sure.
I'm really curious how you sanity check your model. One thing we know about complex models is that errors are really easy to hide in the data. And having tried to build these models myself, I've seen those errors in my own models. And now that I'm managing some other people trying to do this, it's even harder to check their work. So sanity checking, yeah.
You need to teach me about that, because I know there are ways to do it, and I know there are ways to evaluate and to go about that, but I'm not an expert in that by any stretch of the term.
My rough idea that I have not tried yet is to implement layers of models with increasing levels of complexity, and to make sure that the more complex models are kind of roughly similar to the simpler models.
We should talk about that more. I know for sure that there are well-defined ways to do it. I know that they're covered in the book, and I can't recall them off the top of my head, but there's definitely like well-defined ways to go about it. There's one down here. Getting his steps in.
As your team grows and expands and other teams want to continue using a model like this, how do you support other people onboarding into what is a kind of potentially kind of very internalized model that you've created? How do you train others to be able to pick it up even if you were to switch roles or switch teams?
So the question is like how I would evangelize this across my organization, or how I would pass the torch down if I were to do something different.
How do you I've like thought to build models like this and then worry that if I reprioritize my own work and I step off the team, or if I change companies, what will happen to that model after I leave, or after someone else is picking it up as their area of responsibility? Is that something that you have recommendations for, or?
I can't say that I've done this myself, but because I've used this again for my team personally as in a bubble almost. But what I would recommend would be to educate people above you in the chain of command as to how the value of this, and then educate the people that are implementing the initiatives that come from the insights you get from this as to how they relate back to the model. So hopefully whenever somebody new comes in, the top and the bottom will be able to create pressure on that person to continue using those models. But I haven't done this myself.
Thank you.
Okay, if you have any more questions, you can ask them outside. Let's give Arthur a round of applause. Thank you.